Hi, today I'm going to talk to a little bit about a technique that we use in Philadelphia for valuation of multi-purpose buildings. So there's a rising trend, we think, across the country of large multi-purpose buildings. And historically, you would see ancillary uses within a primary type of building that were really there for the tenant's convenience and supported the existing rent. So you would see like a convenience store in an apartment building or restaurants in an office building. But those uses were there primarily for the tenant's convenience and didn't provide any real income stream to the owner. But the new trend is that these ancillary uses generate significant income streams for the ownership, and they're not necessarily there for the tenant convenience. And they may support an overall increase in rents, at least within certain portions of the building. Um, and these buildings can be a single building or multiple buildings or even an entire city block that's treated as one entity. Now, there's a lot of benefits to this approach. If you own one of these buildings, you're limiting the risk by diversifying portfolio. It used to be if you wanted to diversify your portfolio, you had to buy multiple buildings. You had to buy an apartment building, an office building, a retail building. Um, but with this approach, you can own one building and diversify your portfolio. This is a photograph of the building where I used to work. And this building has in it a couple of restaurants, some doctor's offices, um, a lot of just regular offices, a lot of retail space, a parking garage, and some very high-end apartments. So this protects the owner against downturns in any specific market. So if the office building market is going through a difficult phase, they're still able to generate income out of this building. So it really limits their risk. It increases exposure for the building as a whole, and that's going to allow for higher and more stable rents. And now, instead of just being an office building, now you're getting some benefits from customers that pass by or foot traffic. So here's some examples, some other examples from Philadelphia. This is what's the Sierra Center South, and this is a very large land parcel that's owned by the University of Pennsylvania. And primarily the high rise here is a Class A plus office building, 624,000 square feet. It's got 4,000 square feet of retail in it, 1,000 square feet of storage, and a hotel with 268 rooms. This other building is a 1,500 space parking garage. And then this third building is an 850 bed student housing. It's a dormitory for the University of Pennsylvania. And all of these buildings are air rights accounts on this one land parcel. So here's another example. This is a building called East Market, which is two apartment towers that have 204 one-bedroom apartments, 40 one-bedroom apartments that have dens, 72 bedroom units, 248 studio units, 61,000 square feet of retail, a below-grade parking garage, and two digital signs that generate an incredible amount of income. Here's another example, a building called Lincoln Square, and this is primarily an office building. So it's got 181 bedroom units, 13 one-bedroom units with dens, 54 two-bedroom units, 21 three-bedroom units, 54 studios. But it also has an indoor parking garage with 423 spaces, 100,000 square feet of retail space, including a Target store, and there's a separate grocery store, 90,000 square foot grocery store. Another one is the Comcast Technology Center. It's primarily an office building, primarily Comcast offices. So there's 1 million square feet of office space. There are 3 condo residential units. And there's a Four Seasons Hotel that has 217 rooms and a wonderful rooftop restaurant. So historically, your typical approach would be to develop one rate per square foot for the entire building, regardless of the use. So the office space, if it's an office building, you were going to treat it as office space, all of it, at whatever the office building rate was. You'd only have one location influence, that's the location influence for office buildings. You'd use one vacancy and expense ratio as well as one capitalization rate for the entire building. And your gross building area might actually include some condo accounts, which should be subtracted from the GBA. So the challenges that these buildings pose, one of them is in the way that typical assessment office is organized. And they will typically have units that specialize in specific types of buildings. So in our office, we had a unit that did apartment buildings, and a unit that did commercial properties, and a unit that did office buildings, and a unit that did industrial buildings. But nobody that was really well versed in that hybrid approach and understanding how you do a building that's part office, part retail, part apartments. So the location influences are different for office space, apartments, retail space. So you have to be able to account for multiple location influences within one building. The different use breakdowns have to be captured in your data. So if you look at your data for the building, you've got to know how many apartments or how many square feet of apartments, how many square feet of retail, how many parking spaces. You need to know all of these things, and that has to be captured in your data. Typically, you would just get the gross building area for the building and treat it all as one entity. Your vacancy and expense ratio, as well as the capitalization rates, may vary within each building. So you might have more risk associated and different vacancy and expense ratio associated with apartments than you would for office space. And so you can't get by just using one vacancy and expense ratio and one cap rate. And if you have condos in the buildings, you have to recognize that they are separate accounts, and that square footage has to be subtracted from the building breakdowns. So if we're going to model these, what do we need to know? At the building level, we need to know the gross building area, number of stories, vacancy and expense ratios for whatever uses are in the building, cap rates for each use type in the building, a location for each use in the building, possibly a different location for each use in the building, and the overall condition or class of the building. You also need characteristics of the other characteristics of the property, such as number of parking spaces, how much is ballroom space, how much is storage space, other ancillary uses. For each lease space that you're going to use in building the model, you need to know the size of the space leased, of course, the date that the space was leased. You need to know the floor that the lease space is on, and the type of lease, whether it's a triple net, modified gross, or full service lease. You need to have income rates for the ancillary uses. But one of the really nice things about this approach is that you don't need a complete rent roll for any building. And in your typical income approach, you would need a complete rent roll for the entire building. With this approach, you don't need that at all. So we'll talk a little bit about the location influences. So as I've said, each building may be subject to multiple location influences. So here we have an office building, and it's in an office location, a location that we use for other similar office buildings. But it's got apartments in it, and those boundaries don't conform. They're not the same boundaries that we use for offices. It's a whole different set of boundaries and different influences. And it's also got retail space, which is a third location that has to be accounted for. So we have to be able to apply the appropriate rate for each type of space per location that's present in the building. So how do we model the income? Well, we're going to build an income model that's going to solve for the primary use, the rental rates for the primary use per square foot that are going to be specific for each building. So each building is going to have a different rate depending on all of these factors. So we're going to make adjustments for, let's say, office buildings in this case. What's the grade of the office building? What's the typical lease space size for each class? What's the street class of the building? In other words, how much traffic does it get? When was the building built? What's the location that we're going to use for office space? And how much square footage lies in each of these different floors. We made packets or buckets, and because the rates for floors 1 to 15 might be one thing, but then they're a little higher for the mid-floor packet, floor 16 to 30, and then the highest rents are going to be above the 30th floor. So this is what that model would look like, where we're solving for the log of rent per square foot for full service rents. So then we would apply rates for the ancillary space. So after we model rates for the primary use within the building, we're going to import rates from models for other types of buildings to estimate income from the ancillary space. So this might be our set of coefficients for the office building, our constant and coefficients. And so each building could have a different custom tailored rate from the model. But then within this office building, if there's retail space, we're going to go look up the retail area that it's in, and we're going to use that rate per square foot for retail space in that building. And if it's got apartments, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find the apartment location, and we might either use a rate per unit or a rate per square foot to assign value to the apartment component. So now we've got all these different kind of rates blending within the building, and each one is specific for the type of space that's being leased. So once we have these rates, what we do is we take each building has its own analysis sheet, and we identify the building, and we build this nice little form that has all the specific modeled rates for this building that come from the income model. If it's an apartment building, it's the rates from the apartment building model, income model, retail building income model. In this case, it's an office building, so these are the rates for the low bay, mid bay, high bay office space for, this is, I believe, a class A+ building. And then we have generic rates for other uses that are present in the building. So we have rates for parking, per parking space, rates for storage space, rates for meeting room space, rates for retail space. Now the retail space is not going to be generated by the model for this specific building. It's going to be the retail, the central tendency retail space for the retail in this location. And we're able to use that to estimate the income for each of these tranches within the buildings, or each of these uses within the building. And we're able to generate a total potential income, and then we take out vacancy and expense, vacancy and collection loss, expense and collection loss, and then we can have a cap rate that's specific to this building. If there are other things that affect the cap rate, they can be included to get your overall cap rate. So now we're going to take our net operating income from all of our sources. We're gonna capitalize that to come up with an estimated income value and value per square foot. Now we're also, since we run a sales model for these buildings, we can bring in the results from the sales model. So we can bring in, so that can be compared to the results from the income model, both for the entire building and on a rate per square foot basis. And then we'd also want to show if there had been appeals, what the values of this building had been over the last 2 years, and whether there had been any appeals filed on this building, because maybe the value that's on it came from an appeal, or there might be a court stipulation. So in each case now, the evaluator, having all of this to play with, and they can change anything in this form, and the entire form will recalculate. They can change the cap rate, and the entire form will recalculate. They can change the rates for, the high bay office space, or the square footage. If the data is incorrect, they can change the square footage for any of these, and the entire form will recalculate on the fly. So at the end of this process, they have to come up with a final reconciled value for the building, and they could lean primarily on the income approach or on the sales approach, whatever seems to be most appropriate. And then it'll calculate what the percentage change is from the previous year's value. And then there's further, because we have to tax land and buildings separately, you can either enter the percentage that goes to the land, or you can enter a building value or land value, and it'll recalculate the allocation. So we build one of these sheets for each building. So here's a couple of others. This is a Class A office building that has 76,000 square feet of retail space and 400 square feet of indoor parking. This one is another Class A office building that has a lot of retail space, indoor parking. And this one's also a Class A building that has retail space. But this building has apartments. And in this case, the evaluator would be able to enter the apartment square footage and the rate to be used for that apartment square footage, and it would update the entire form for this building. So we've used this approach. It's really made a difference in our commercial and industrial units, our non-residential units, in improving the accuracy and the reliability and the uniformity of their values, and it's made a big difference on what they give away on appeal and what they've been able to keep. So thanks for taking a look at this method. If you think you have some interest in it, there's of course more to it than we can show in this short presentation, but this should be enough to give you the general idea of how it works. Thanks again. Bye-bye.